Thank you all so much for joining this installment of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism's Benjamin and Barbara Zucker lecture series. I'm Josh Kalla, and I'm an assistant professor of political science and statistics and data science at Yale University. And I'm very excited to be inviting Laura Royden to give us a talk today on anti-Semitic attitudes among young Americans. Laura is a fifth-year Ph.D. student in the government department at Harvard University. She is currently focused on anti-Semitism and Jewish politics, but also interested in election and judicial politics. Prior to starting her Ph.D. at Harvard, Laura worked at the Brennan Center for Justice in the Harvard Kennedy School. She completed her undergraduate studies at MIT in urban studies and planning in 2014. And we're very excited to have you at this joint program of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism and the American and Comparative Political Behavior workshop. Throughout the talk, if you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A. And if there are clarifying questions during the talk, I will moderate those and potentially interrupt Laura with those clarifying questions. And then if you have substantive questions, please try and save those for the end and put those in the Q&A in Zoom. Chat is disabled and we're not going to call on people, so please just put everything in that Q&A function. And with that, I will hand it over to Laura. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Josh, for that introduction. Thanks to Yale for having me, and thanks to everyone for coming today. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this project, which has been a joint effort with Eitan Hirsch at Tufts. Broadly speaking, this project is a series of survey questions and experiments that we designed to examine anti-Semitic attitudes among American adults. I think we originally envisioned this project being one paper, but it ended up turning into three because we realized we really wanted enough space to be able to discuss the topic and our results with the level of nuance that I think we can all agree it deserves. 3 papers is obviously way too much to present fully in the next 45 minutes, so I'm going to present some of the core findings from one of the papers, which was recently published in PRQ for the political scientists. And this one focuses on ideological and age dimensions of anti-Semitic attitudes in the US. So I'm going to talk through our theory, our hypotheses, and our findings, and end briefly by highlighting our work in the other 2 papers. Of course, I'm happy to talk about those papers or more detailed findings from this one later or offline with anyone. So why did we decide to do this project? Well, starting about 5 years ago, we've seen a series of high-profile anti-Semitic incidents in America. We've seen the Tree of Life shooting, the Charlottesville Unite the Right march, but also more common incidents like the defacement of synagogues and harassment of Jewish Americans, both violently and non. And all of this has, perhaps unsurprisingly, been paralleled by a sharp increase in perceived concern about anti-Semitism. As of last year, 62% of all Americans and 88% of Jewish Americans now consider anti-Semitism a problem. 1 in 4 Jews surveyed by the AJC, or the American Jewish Committee, said that they had personally experienced anti-Semitism in the past year. So there's certainly a recent salience to anti-Semitism in American politics, and a sense that it's something worth looking at empirically. But we also noticed something else that made this a compelling topic, which is that there's a lot of focus in news media and popular commentators, not just on this rise of anti-Semitism, but specifically on how anti-Semitism seems to be popping up on both the far left and the far right. And I really mean there's a lot of focus, really quite a lot of focus about the relationship between extreme ideology and anti-Semitism. Now, this makes sense because many of the recent high-profile anti-Semitic incidents, like the ones I just mentioned, have been associated with either far left or far right politics, not just one or the other. But a prejudice rising on both ideological extremes, yet not in the center, is a fairly unique and interesting pattern that we don't see very much in American politics. So naturally, being the political scientists that we are, we decided to focus this project on getting a clearer picture of the pattern and whether it exists in mass public attitudes instead of just as these anecdotes. Now, we're calling this pattern the horseshoe pattern of anti-Semitism because it mirrors a broader theory of ideology known as horseshoe theory. And horseshoe theory is the idea that ideology isn't a straight line running from far left to far right, as we would usually think about it, but instead it's bent like a horseshoe. So functionally what this means is we would have the center at the top of the horseshoe and bent down so that the far left and the far right are actually much closer to each other than they are to the center. Now, horseshoe theory became somewhat well-known in American politics around the 2016 election, with the simultaneous rise of the Bernie left and the Trump right, which arguably both share a populist base and frustration with the prior ruling elites in both parties. It hasn't really gained traction as a broad theory to explain American politics, but it has endured in discussions of American anti-Semitism. Two recent popular books, one by Barry Weiss, who used to work for the New York Times, and one by Deborah Lipstadt, a well-known historian who's now actually leading the Biden administration's work on anti-Semitism, do a great job of fully laying out the case for why this horseshoe pattern might have arisen. And why might that be? Well, extreme anti-Semitism on both sides could have a shared cause. If burgeoning populism among these extremes leads to a frustration with the capitalist status quo, this could feed into old stereotypes about Jews as shadowy overlords who control government and finance, which could then lead to an increase in anti-Semitic attitudes on both ideological extremes. But it could also be for independent reasons that happen to both be occurring now. Growing white nationalist sentiment on the far right might lead directly to anti-Semitic attitudes, with Jews being seen as a shady group, either pretending to be white or siding with the non-white population politically, given how liberal American Jews are. Anti-Semitic sentiment on the far left, on the other hand, may have spilled over from their views on Israel, as the political left has steadily become more supportive of the Palestinian cause and more critical towards Israel. We've seen progressive politicians draw direct comparisons between Black Lives Matter, a cause that obviously holds a lot of leftist support, with the Palestinian cause. So if the far right has begun to view Israel negatively and as the clear oppressor in the Palestinian conflict, those negative views may spill over towards Jews more broadly. So we designed this project primarily to examine whether or not this horseshoe pattern of anti-Semitism exists for either of the above reasons. But there's one important wrinkle in the horseshoe pattern of anti-Semitism that we really wanted to focus on as well. And that's what's going on with young adults in terms of anti-Semitism. So there's two reasons why looking at young adults' anti-Semitic attitudes here is interesting. The first is that we know from prior work that young adults are generally more tolerant, less prejudicial, hold more cosmopolitan attitudes than older adults do. But a number of prior studies have found that they actually tend to have higher rates specifically of anti-Semitism. It's been theorized that this may be to the declining salience of the Holocaust as we move further away from World War II, or to the increased salience of the Israel-Palestine conflict, particularly given the more liberal leanings of young adults. So we're interested to see if this is still true, but we're also interested to see whether there was an ideological dimension specific to young adult anti-Semitism. And that's because there are two ideological movements that may make the horseshoe pattern more extreme, specifically among young adults. On the right, we've seen the growth of the white nationalist alt-right, which has occurred primarily online and thus has gained a large following specifically among young men. On the left, we've seen a huge burst in pro-Palestinian activism on college campuses and in social justice circles, which are heavily populated by young adults. Now, both of these movements may really increase the pathways to extreme anti-Semitism I described on the previous slide, and thus could accentuate the horseshoe pattern. So we focused on young adults to see if that was indeed the case. So we wanted to examine mass attitudes among young adults and the ideological extremes. So what did we do? Of course, we ran an original survey. It was fielded by YouGov right after the 2020 election. And we have this big 2,500 person oversample of younger adults in order to really be able to examine the rise in anti-Semitism that might be most prominent among this age group. And we also have a 1,000 person sample of the full adult population. So that gives us a 3,500 person sample in total, which we can and will break into smaller groups. Before I get into the meat of the survey, here's the distribution of the respondents ideologically. Most of our analysis is using a standard 7-point ideology scale, going from very liberal to very conservative. But we did also duplicate the analysis using an alternative measure of ideology. So we explicitly asked respondents if they identify as more extreme labels like alt-right or leftists. And rerunning all of the analysis with those labels, we get essentially the same results. So for simplicity and ease of understanding, I'm going to present everything here using the 7-point ideology scale. But just know that this does hold up, even if we just look at more extreme identifiers. So you can see the distribution here. We do have more liberal young adults than we do older adults, and we also have more liberal young adults than we do conservative young adults. But 30% of our young sample is still conservative. So that's fairly good. We have a fairly good distribution here and enough to really be able to analyze these buckets. Our sample of older adults is fairly well distributed as well. So before I show you the questions we use to measure anti-Semitism, I want to pause and note that there have been decades of debate about how exactly to define anti-Semitism or what counts as anti-Semitism, and it certainly still remains a hot topic. So here, we're primarily focusing on attitudes that respondents hold towards American Jews. Do they think of Jews in stereotypical or demonizing ways, or do they treat Jews differently from how they treat other minority groups? And we decided to measure this form of anti-Semitism in 2 different ways. We measure overt anti-Semitism via direct agreement with specific claims about Jews. And then we also measure more subtle anti-Semitism through a series of experiments about whether Jews are held to higher standards than other groups of Americans. Now, we do this for 2 reasons. The first is to feel more confident in our results by triangulating across the strengths and weaknesses of these 2 ways to measure prejudice. The second reason is to respond to another key aspect of the popular discussion around ideological anti-Semitism, which is this repeated idea that left-wing anti-Semitism is more subtle, or that it's more insidious and gets glossed over, or that it goes under the radar. And that this has really allowed the left to essentially hide its anti-Semitism and avoid addressing it as sort of real anti-Semitism. So in order to try and measure what these commentators argue are somewhat hidden views, we also really wanted to include these less overt survey experiments to potentially draw out these hidden yet honest views, if they exist. So I'm going to start with our overt anti-Semitism battery, which consists of 3 questions with different anti-Semitic stereotypes. Jews are more loyal to Israel than to America. It's appropriate to boycott Jewish businesses as a form of opposition to Israel, and that Jews in the United States have too much power. Now, these are questions that have been asked before by organizations and researchers to measure anti-Semitism, but as an additional check, we also took any respondent who said they were Jewish, and instead of asking them if they agreed with these statements, although the results there might be a little bit interesting, we instead asked them if they found them anti-Semitic. And across the board, at least 75% of Jewish respondents agreed that each statement was anti-Semitic. We see agreement as high as 90% for the boycott measure. So that's another indication that these are probably reasonable questions to gauge anti-Semitism. And now we paired this overt anti-Semitism battery with a priming experiment. Half of our respondents were first primed with the following quote, which is a true finding, explaining that Gallup found that 95% of Jews have favorable views of Israel. And we did this to see if we could draw out any of this potentially masked anti-Semitism, since perhaps priming respondents who are already critical of Israel with information that Jews are an outgroup to them on this issue would make them respond more negatively and perhaps more honestly about their views of Jews. Respondents may feel more okay responding with their true beliefs if it could be viewed as a criticism of Israel instead of just anti-Semitism, in other words. So we had a few different hypotheses. First, we expected to find that anti-Semitic attitudes would be higher among the ideological extremes. In other words, giving us this horseshoe-shaped pattern. We expected to find that younger adults would in general be more anti-Semitic than older adults, but we also expected that the horseshoe pattern would be more extreme among younger adults. In other words, we expected that most of the increase in anti-Semitism among younger adults would be among the far left and the far right young adults, rather than sort of uniformly increased across all young adults. And finally, we expected that the prime about Israel should increase anti-Semitic attitudes specifically on the ideological left, since that's where we expect anti-Semitic attitudes, if they exist, to be intertwined with anti-Israel attitudes. So, what did we find? Here we have charts showing agreement with each of the 3 overt anti-Semitism questions. The x-axis on each chart is going from very liberal to very conservative, and we have the percentage of respondents in each bucket who agreed with the statement on the y-axis. The black dots here show agreement among younger adults. Again, those are people aged 18 to 30. And the gray squares show agreement among older adults, or those over 30. So right off the bat, we can see that there's no evidence of horseshoe theory here. For all 3 questions among younger and older adults, respondents on the far left have some of the lowest rates of agreement with the overt anti-Semitic statements. So instead of a horseshoe pattern, which we would expect to look something like this, we see that agreement with anti-Semitic statements broadly increases as we move from liberal to conservative. But we can also see that there's a more complicated relationship with age here that seems to be modified by ideology. There isn't much difference on the left between younger and older adults, here, here, and here. But there's a strong difference on the right. And we particularly see this in the boycott and the too much power measure, and particularly among the most conservative adults for these huge 40-point gaps here. So overall, this means that younger adults do have slightly higher agreement, especially with the boycott and power measures, but that's solely driven by this really large increase over here among the young far right, and it's not at all driven by any increases among the young far left. So in all, we don't see a horseshoe pattern, and instead we see much higher agreement on the far right, particularly the young far right. So moving on to looking at the prime, which as a reminder told respondents first that 95% of American Jews have a positive view of Israel. So this chart shows our full sample with all adults just for simplicity, because the results here don't vary by age. Here again, we have ideology on the x-axis, moving from very liberal to very conservative, and agreement with each statement on the y-axis. So this time, the black dots represent agreement levels for respondents who saw the prime, whereas the gray squares represent agreement levels for respondents who did not. And we expected that the prime would increase anti-Semitic sentiments on the left, which probably has more anti-Israel sentiments as well. However, we don't really see that that's the case. We get null and/or small effects almost across the board here. We really do not see much impact for the prime. The only place we really do see substantial effects is right here among moderates when it comes to agreeing specifically that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to America. We see about a 20-point increase here for moderates. Now, the prime not working doesn't necessarily mean that the left doesn't hold negative views of Israel. It could be instead that it's common knowledge that Jews hold favorable views towards Israel for a lot of our respondents, and thus they didn't gain any new information from the prime. And perhaps then the prime worked on moderates specifically for the loyalty measure, because some research has found that moderates may in general know less about politics and or be less set in their beliefs, so they might be more moved by the prime, specifically for the relevant statement about Israel loyalty. Another option could be that the prime just wasn't strong enough to counteract social desirability bias on the left. So even when prompted with information about Israel, they still know that they shouldn't express these sentiments about Jews. Now, this lingering concern about social desirability bias on the left brings us nicely to our double standard experiments, which we use to see if respondents across the spectrum are treating Jews differently from how they treat other groups. So these experiments reduce social desirability concerns a bit, since we're going to be asking the same question, but with different minority groups substituted in. So if they have concerns about expressing these sentiments, they should feel it a little less if it's directly compared to another group. So how do we do this? Well, again, here we split our respondents into two groups. We asked one group if they thought Jewish Americans who participate in social justice activism should have to denounce Israel's discrimination against non-Jews. And we asked the second group if they thought the same thing, but for Muslim Americans denouncing Muslim countries' discrimination of non-Muslims. Now, we picked this question because there have been anecdotal news stories about organizations, particularly on college campuses or in other social justice spaces, that have pressured Jewish members to denounce Israel or denounce Zionism if they want to participate. And we really wanted a real-world example here that respondents might have thought about or heard about.
Hey, sorry, Laura, just to jump in with a quick clarifying question. Can you explain a little bit more how this double standard experiment helps reduce social desirability bias? So folks, you're doing this between subjects design, so folks are still being asked either just about Jews or just about Muslims. So
yes.
Why, if they're being asked about Jews, don't you think there's a chance they might hide their true opinion?
So there definitely is still a chance, but there's also a chance they would hide it against Muslims as well. So I guess it's sort of evening the playing field a little bit about social desirability bias, because we can ask essentially the same question about two different groups. So we might think that social desirability bias is going to come into play for both Jews and Muslims.
Got it. So the assumption is there's like this standard baseline level of social desirability bias against both groups. We're going to partial that out by looking at the difference between the Jews and Muslims.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Seems plausible. Do you have any? Yeah, it'd be interesting if you have data to check that, but I'll let you keep going.
Thanks. Yeah. So this chart here now shows results with the percentage of respondents, both from the full sample and just young adults, who agreed with either statement. The black squares here show the respondents who said that Jews should denounce Israel, whereas the gray circles show respondents who said that Muslims should denounce Muslim countries. We expected to see an anti-Jewish double standard on the left and an anti-Muslim double standard on the right. So let's just look at the first half of this chart for now, the all adults chart. We see this is the case, but we see it to different magnitudes. We see this double standard on the left. We see this anti-Jewish double standard on the left, with the far left being about 15 to 20 percentage points more likely to say that Jews should denounce Israel. But looking at the far right, we see that the far right is about 40 percentage points more likely to say that Muslims should denounce Muslim discrimination. And now looking across the ideological spectrum, just in this chart, we do see that those on the far left are more likely overall to say that Jews should have to denounce Israel than those on the right. For those on the left, again, it's around a little less than 50%, and on the right, it's down here around 20, 25%. So this suggests that there may be some forms of anti-Semitism, such as the one here about holding Jews to a certain collective standard, that may be more prominent on the left than on the right. But if we look at just young adults in the right panel, we intriguingly see something different. So here, looking at respondents' agreements that Jews should denounce Israel, we see that both the young far left and the young far right are much more likely to agree with this denouncement than the center. So unlike any of our previous findings, here we do actually see this U-shaped pattern indicating that there is both a higher standard for Jews on the left and the right. And this is our only indication so far of any pattern that would match horseshoe theory. We also see that the results for Muslims remain relatively similar as for older adults, generally increases with ideology for both cases. And this suggests that something unique might be going on here with young adults and anti-Semitism. But again, there's actually relatively little change between all adults on the far left and young adults on the far left. The new U-shaped pattern is coming from young far right respondents being about 15 percentage points more likely to say that Jews should denounce Israel than the older far right respondents were. So while there is some hint then that the far left is exhibiting a double standard towards Jews, that doesn't seem to vary by age. The young far right instead seems to have become much more critical of Jews than older far right adults, which both lines up with and provides some nuance to our prior findings of anti-Semitism being the strongest among the young far right. So we did a second double standard experiment as well to make sure that our answers weren't solely being driven by views on Muslim Americans. So here we used Catholic Americans and Indian Americans as a comparison group. Catholics, another religious group that have an explicitly religious country affiliated with them in the Vatican, and they've also been accused of holding dual loyalty to the Vatican. We use Indian Americans here as another group associated with a foreign ally, India, and Indian Americans also hold relatively high socioeconomic status in the US for a minority group. So this double standard experiment actually had a few questions, but I'm just going to show one. And again, the results are similar across the different questions. So we again randomized our sample into 3 groups, and we asked each one if they thought either Jewish, Indian, or Catholic Americans should be held responsible for Israel, India, or the Vatican's actions. And here we hypothesized that both the political left and the political right would be more willing to hold Jewish Americans responsible for Israel's actions. This might be the case due to stereotypes of Jews as being more powerful than other minority groups, but we thought this also might be present on the far left due to discourse again around Palestinian activism, the role Jewish Americans should play, and general criticism of Israel. But looking
real quick, Laura,
yes,
we just have a clarifying question from Michelle. Can you talk a little bit about the x-axis, so the liberal, mod, conservative? So in particular, Michelle wanted to know, did these subjects identify themselves as far right or far left?
Yeah, so here again, these axes are going from, we asked people, do you identify as very liberal, liberal, somewhat liberal, moderate, somewhat conservative, conservative, and very conservative. So we have very liberal here and very conservative here. Again, we did rerun all of this analysis with specifically more extreme labels, using like leftist, socialist, progressive, alt-right, Christian conservative, things like that. And the results are essentially the same, but I'm using ideology here because it's easier to see a nice trend across ideology from a more continuous measure.
And we also have a question from Cheryl on this measure of just like, isn't held accountable very different from should condemn? So if you could talk about maybe some of the different measures you looked at.
Yeah, definitely. So held accountable is we wanted to use these different measures here because we didn't want to just have one specific measure. So our held accountable measure is slightly different from our should condemn measure. We have another measure, which is whether or not these groups should do more to make, whether Jewish, Indian, and Catholic Americans should do more to make Israel, India, and the Vatican sort of better countries or like more, better actors, essentially. And yeah, you're right that these are potentially picking up on different things. So we wanted to change them a little bit just to make sure, again, that the specific wording in any of our measures wasn't accidentally picking up on a trend and giving us spurious results. So looking at our results here, we can see once again that we don't have this horseshoe pattern. Among all adults on the left and among younger adults on the right, there's no horseshoe pattern. We don't see any of this U-shaped. In both cases, adults on the far left are the least likely to hold Jews accountable. And there doesn't even seem to really be an anti-Jewish double standard here. We actually find an anti-Catholic double standard, which is interesting, but not the focus of this talk. The far right also doesn't have an anti-Jewish double standard. In both cases, they're the least likely to say that Jews should be held accountable, but they're still more likely overall to say that Jews should be held accountable for Israel than people on the far left. And comparing all adults to younger adults, we again see that this age effect scales as we move ideologically from liberal to conservative. So there's essentially no change between younger and older adults on the left, but on the far right, we see that younger far right adults are about 20 percentage points more likely to hold Jews responsible for Israel, which again suggests that something unique is going on here with young far right adults' views on Jews. So tying this all together, what did we learn here about the ideological and age patterns of anti-Semitism? Well, we first learned that there isn't much evidence for a broad horseshoe pattern of anti-Semitism. Even when we do see a U-shaped graph, anti-Semitism generally remains much higher on the right. And so we find that anti-Semitic attitudes generally are much higher on the far right than they are on the far left. Looking by age, we do see that young adults express more anti-Semitic attitudes than older ones do, but this is almost entirely driven by a large increase on the young right. Now, we do find a few anti-Jewish double standards on the left, including a few more subtle ones in the paper that I didn't include here because they're along the same lines as the Jewish-Muslim double standard. But in each case, they're overshadowed by much stronger anti-Jewish views, especially on the young right, for the same questions. So I'd say the one sentence takeaway from this talk and this paper is that horseshoe theory does not seem to accurately describe anti-Semitism in America, since we find that the epicenter is fairly clearly among the young far right. But before I end, I do want to quickly talk about our other two papers, which shed light on interesting aspects outside of horseshoe theory here. So our second paper in this project looks at anti-Semitic attitudes among racial minorities, specifically Black and Hispanic Americans. So prior work has long shown that these groups do tend to hold more anti-Semitic attitudes than white Americans, and we find that this is true as well, particularly among young adults. Somewhat concerningly, we find that Black and Hispanic respondents agree with these overt anti-Semitic statements at around the same rate as white alt-right respondents do. So with this finding, we then examine whether or not our results match any previously proposed theories for minority anti-Semitism. These range from greater Palestinian solidarity to minority groups perhaps conflating Jews with white people and actually expressing anti-whiteness, to geographic conflict or general group competition, among many others. So using other questions from our surveys to test these theories, we find that actually none of these common theories explain the differences that we find among our respondents. And this suggests that we really need a new wave of theorizing and a lot more research into the intersection between race and anti-Semitism to better figure out what's going on here. Our third paper is a little different, and it looks at the young left's views on Israel. So underlying a lot of the commentary on left-wing anti-Semitism is the idea that the far left, particularly the young far left, really dislikes Israel. But the extent to which that's actually empirically true was unclear, so we decided to find out. So using a few more experiments and asking about specific countries, we find that the young left does seem to have this persistently negative view towards Israel. They view Israel more negatively than older liberals do or other young adults do. And young far left adults also view Israel more negatively than they view other countries allied with the United States. So checking two plausible explanations, we find that this view doesn't seem to be explained by an issue prioritization of the Israel-Palestine conflict among the left. And we also find that their negative attitudes extend beyond criticisms of Israel's government and seem to spill over into criticism of things like Israel's culture, languages, and religion. So these findings also don't fit neatly with existing theories or what we'd expect from partisan polarized views of foreign countries. So we again argue that more research is really needed here to grapple seriously with what's going on with views of both Jews and Israel. And that's all I have here. I wanted to mention that I have a few new projects I'm starting on that are somewhat related. One is on the connection between anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories, and another is on how the conditional whiteness of Jews and Jews' relatively high status affects perceptions of anti-Semitism. But I'd love to hear from everyone here, any thoughts on what people found the most compelling about this, or best directions to go in from here with this specific avenue of research, as well, of course, as any questions or really any comments about any part of this. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Laura. Super, super interesting work. So if folks have any questions, please put those in the Q&A and I will moderate them. We already have a few questions there now. So first question is, how do we know that these results are not due to random variability in the sample? In other words, were statistical tests used to determine if these results are actually significant? So can you talk a little bit about those confidence intervals on your graphs?
Yeah, definitely. So all the confidence intervals, I guess I should share my screen again instead of having stopped shared it. Yeah, so all of the confidence intervals shown on our graphs here, these are 95% confidence intervals. So we use standard confidence intervals to test that actually these are statistically significant gaps. And based on, we have a pretty large sample size, so we can be pretty sure that these are statistically significant and we're actually picking up on real differences instead of random variability. And again, having sort of this large, fairly spread out sample across the ideological spectrum really helps us here.
Thanks. Another question from David Kaslow. What beliefs are connected with anti-Semitism? Specifically, is the belief in zero sum, that there is only a fixed amount of happiness, success, money, and that an increase in this amount in one group decreases this amount in another group? Is this idea of zero sum a belief connected with anti-Semitism and something you studied in either this paper or other work you have ongoing?
Yeah, so that comes up, that's definitely a proposed theory that comes up specifically in a lot of the theories about racial minorities. Sort of one of the new theories there is that there's sort of zero sum, either material resources or even zero sum sympathy that society awards to different minority groups who have suffered. And so some of the anti-Semitic sentiment we could be picking up on might be because Jews are perceived as both sort of the victims of anti-Semitism, but again, they're well off in America socioeconomically. So this does create sort of this odd, tension of, well, they're being discriminated against, but they're doing better than other minority groups. So that's something I'm really interested in looking at with my next project about views of privilege and status and how that affects perceptions of anti-Semitism. Does that lead people to be less sympathetic towards Jews or to express more anti-Semitic sentiments in general?
Question from Iran Rubinstein. So have you looked at any sort of geographical differences, specifically like urban versus non-urban pattern in these results? And I'll add on top of that is, have you looked at, especially among the young people, college educated versus not college educated?
Yep, so we look at both of these things. So I didn't include any of our regression tables here because I think it's generally very overwhelming when someone puts up a gigantic regression table in a slide. But all of these results here that I'm showing on graphs, we do regression analysis as well, and we find the same results for all of them. But in those cases, we're able to control for college education and geography in particular. So we look at both of those things, and specifically in our paper about racial minority anti-Semitism, those are two common confounder theories that are proposed for why racial groups might have higher rates of anti-Semitism. And we basically dismiss both of those. So yes, we have information about college, which we've used to confirm. For geography, we only have state level data, unfortunately, from YouGov. So we can't do anything as direct as, Ryan Enos does in his work when he can directly sort of look at how neighborhoods and contact increases prejudice. But there are actually a lot of states where there are essentially no Jews. So we do compare people who respond from those states, assuming they have essentially no contact with Jews, with people responding from states that have a much higher Jewish population, like New York, California, Florida. And we don't see all these things still persist. All of our results still persist and are robust to that.
And a related question from Michelle Edgar. So some states require Holocaust education as part of like the K through 12 schooling, other states do not. Have you looked at whether there are any differences between states that have that Holocaust education requirement and states that don't?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that, but that's actually a great idea and something that I'm curious about and might fit into maybe the project about perceptions of Jews is along those lines, but it's about when we ask people questions about Jews, presumably a large portion of our respondents don't know any Jewish people. So what are they thinking about? There's probably some respondents who are like, oh, like, my friends are Jewish and they're completely normal people. I like them. But if you don't know Jews, what are you thinking of when you think of a Jewish American? Are you thinking of some stereotype of, a Hasidic Jew living in an insular community? Because that's often how, especially observant Jews, are portrayed in media and in the news. Or are you thinking of, a random Reform Jew who lives in your town and lives in your community? So that's something that I think is really interesting, and I would love to look at more because I'm very interested in what people know about Judaism and how all these things lead to different views on Jews and different parts of anti-Semitism.
And I guess following up on that question about stereotypes, so I think Susan Fisk has done some work on stereotypes towards Jews, and if I remember correctly, she finds that most Americans hold these stereotypes where Jews are viewed as high competence, but maybe low on warmth. They're viewed kind of coolly. Assuming that my recollection is correct, does she look at all across the either age or ideology, and does she see any sort of difference along the patterns that you're finding here? Or have you looked at these types of like Susan Fisk stereotypes questions in your own work?
Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head what she finds, but that's something that I have been thinking about a lot here. I know there's also work on how Asian Americans are viewed and sort of the idea of racial triangulation, which has been going back, I don't know, a decade, 2 decades. And the idea that minority groups aren't just viewed on a certain spectrum, as we would say, from sort of like bad to good, but there's a sense of, are they viewed coolly or warmly, or in another sense, are they viewed sort of as Americans, or are they viewed as permanent outsiders? And then also, are they viewed as like competent to incompetent, essentially? And so I think there definitely is this push within a lot of the prejudice literature to think of things not just on a single spectrum. And that's something I would definitely want to expand this work out to, because I think it's an obvious place to go from here.
So we have a few questions from folks on the what I'll call the why question. Why is it that the young left uniquely dislikes Israel? Have you thought about this? Have you started to investigate it? What is the role of social media or media more broadly, and opinion leadership, and a different crop of elected officials coming from the left and their views towards Israel? Just, yeah, what have you thought about when it comes to this question of why? Have you started to answer this question? If not, like how do you think you would go about answering this?
Yeah, great question. I have definitely thought a lot about why this is. The question of media, I think. Okay, so we can say one example is, one or potential reason is that the far left is actually just anti-Semitic, and they're channeling all of those views into a more socially acceptable sort of output, which would be criticism of Israel. That is sort of one extreme that may or may not be the case. But there's lots of other potential ideas that we need to check first. The biggest one is probably this question of media and exposure. So it might be that people on the far left really just see lots more news about Israel. They see a lot more news about Israel and Palestine, either because news media covers it more than conflicts in other countries, which is probably true, or that people on social media, these opinion leaders, as you talk about, are posting more about Israel and Palestine. We see especially the Squad, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley. They talk about Israel and Palestine quite a bit. So it could be that the far left holds these uniquely negative views on Israel just because they know more and they're exposed to more negative criticism of Israel, and also just exposed in general to what's going on there. Because there's so much going on in the world, and we know people can't really hold real opinions about what's going on in every single country at once. So I would say those are sort of the two extremes as to what could be going on with the far left, and it could be anywhere along that spectrum. I haven't yet started digging into why that is, in part because it's a thorny issue. It's hard to really get at the core of why do people feel this way about Israel. Because again, with social desirability bias coming in, if you ask someone who really is anti-Semitic, who holds negative views of Israel, why do you feel this way? They're probably going to come up with a reasonable justification that's not, I hate Jews. So it's a tricky thing to get at. But I think, actually going back to what we were just talking about, exploring what people actually know about Israel and what they know about the conflict and things like this could be one way to go about it. And I've considered something, I talked earlier about a lot of the parallels that are drawn between sort of Black Lives Matter and the Israel-Palestine conflict. And something I'm broadly interested in is whether, especially people on the far left, not only see those as parallels, but sort of impute US race relations onto Israel and Palestine. So do they view Israelis as they view Jews in America, who are primarily white? And do they view Palestinians as, they're primarily Arab? So, okay, Muslims in the United States are viewed as not white, so I will view them as not white. And that's sort of a simple issue for the far left to have a stance on, because here in the United States, white people they would view as the oppressors, so they can view the same as Israel and Palestine. Now, we also know that I believe still the majority of Jews in Israel are not Ashkenazi. They're not white. They're not coming from Europe or even America. So I'm interested, one thing I had a thought about is if you prime people with information about what racial demographics in Israel about Israelis and Palestinians, does that change any views they have on Israel? And I haven't really thought it through further than that, but that's something I would be really interested to work on, and someone should do, if not me.
You should do it. It's a great next step. And a few questions sort of from the other side, the far right. So one question is about just why you think there's an age gap on the far right between younger and older. And a related question is about religiosity. How much of this do you think is driven by religiously based anti-Semitic attitudes that might hold both among right-wing white Christians, but also among the Black and Latino population that is more religious?
So religiosity is an easier answer, which is we actually control for this, both in the ideology paper and specifically in the minority anti-Semitism paper. And we do find often higher rates of anti-Semitism among more religious people, but these patterns do persist, even just looking at, more religious people. Still, people on the far right identify or agree more with these anti-Semitic statements, and the same for breaking down racial minority groups. So religiosity certainly plays a role in people's views on Jews and anti-Semitism, but it doesn't explain any of these patterns specifically. Going back to why I think young far right might be more likely to agree, there's a few things. One is, well, maybe it's sort of the same thing. So people on the young, I talked about the growth of the alt-right movement online. Part of sort of the ethos of the alt-right movement and people on the young far right in general is this sort of reactionary attitude to a lot of, so-called political correctness, things like that are going on. And we see people on the young far right being more willing to just express hateful views broadly. We can think about how social media trolling might have played a role in that. So it might be that people on the young far right, it could be that there's actually a decreased social desirability bias among young far right adults. It could be that, they're being reactionary. They think it's good to share these honest attitudes. They're like, I'm not afraid to say what I actually think about Jews and perhaps other minority groups. But it also could be that because lots of these white nationalist alt-right movements are growing online, they're particularly attracting young adults who are overwhelmingly more online, who are going to find these communities. They're going to be on 4chan, things like that. And it could be that just this increased exposure to all of this is making them express more anti-Semitic attitudes in general.
And one question from David Milson is there a way to separate out these attitudes from, let's call it genuine attitudes versus peer-based attitudes, where in some groups it's the cool thing or the in-group thing to hold these anti-Semitic attitudes, even if the individual expressing them does not truly harbor these anti-Semitic attitudes. Do you have any thoughts on that? And I guess a related question would be, is there a relationship between these attitudes and any type of anti-Semitic behavior?
Yeah, both of those are great questions. We don't have any way of linking that to anti-Semitic behavior, and I'm not sure if anyone has ever asked those questions, but that would be a really interesting thing to look at as well. I think it's a great question, and I think partially what it's getting at is this idea of expressive responding on surveys, which is sort of a problem, a concern that comes up more broadly in political science, which is, what if people aren't, when they take a survey, what if they're not responding with their genuine view, but they're responding with the view they know they should hold based on some identity? And we're often really concerned about this when it comes to partisanship and thinking about polarization. So we see very polarized views among the left and the right on all sorts of policy issues. And one question is, well, if you ask people their views on affirmative action, for example, are people who are saying, well, I'm a Democrat, so I'm supposed to support this, so I'll say yes. Are they saying that when they fill out a survey, or are they actually, truly in support of affirmative action? It's very hard to disentangle these things, and that could be part of what's going on here. I would say it's less, I would lean, my gut instinct is that that's less of a concern with our questions specifically than with a lot of these more policy-based questions, because it's not exactly clear that there should be a strict party divide on these issues. We might think, oh, like white nationalists, they're gonna dislike Jews less, But the Republican Party is also very supportive of Israel. And of course, that doesn't mean that they're not anti-Semitic. These two views are sort of separate. But a lot of people on the far right would probably say like, oh yeah, I am supportive of Jews. You know, I support Israel. I support all these things. So it's not clear exactly that there would be such strong expressive responding, but it is something worth exploring and looking at more, definitely.
Perhaps one way you could get at this is about people's perceptions of group norms. So you could ask them, like, what % of your friends do you think would agree with this statement about double standards? And to see if there's a gap between those group norm perceptions and people's positions.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks.
So we are almost at the top of the hour. I believe this talk has been recorded and will be shared in a somewhere. If you want to chime in and
yes,
since we got
sure.
a question on that.
Yes, it will be posted on the IPSA website. It's ypsa.yale.edu in a couple of weeks.
Great, thanks. And Laura, if folks are interested in reading these additional papers, is there a place where they can go to access those?
Probably. I would guess they're probably on my co-author Eitan Hirsch's website. So you could go there, but also anyone is free to contact me, reach out on Twitter. You can find my email and email me, and I'd be happy to share this more with anyone who's interested.
So if folks are interested in the other papers that we got a brief intro to, but lots of discussion about, please reach out to Laura on those. So yeah, thank you all so much. And I hope everyone has a great Friday afternoon and a lovely weekend.
Thanks, everyone.